Hello? Hello? Are we live? Okay. That wasn't embarrassing. So, we are continuing our study in Samuel, the story of the 13th judge, or the final judge. Last time we were introduced to his parents, right? Hannah and her husband. And Hannah can't have kids, right? It's a story that's reminiscent of Leah and Rachel. Her husband has two wives. One has a bunch of kids, and Hannah doesn't. So she goes to the temple, she prays, and Eli then comes, or she makes a vow that if she has a kid, she'll dedicate the kid to the Lord. Eli, the high priest, he comes and he tells her, "Go, God has heard your prayer." And then she ends up having a kid, and to fulfill her vow, she brings Samuel to the temple where she dedicates him to the Lord after she had weaned him. And so we begin with chapter 2, famously with Hannah's song, or Hannah's hymn. And if I were to title this section, I just couldn't help myself. I'd have to call it Hannah, Did You Know? Because Hannah's song is reminiscent, or rather Mary's song is very reminiscent of Hannah's song. Mary's song we know as the Magnificat, and there's probably my favorite song that I theologically don't agree with is the song Mary, Did You Know? Because I don't think she knew. I don't think she knew what was going to happen. But people like quoting the Magnificat, saying that she had some sort of vision of what Christ would become. I have my doubts. So when it comes to Hannah's prayer, there are some debates, discussions about the origin of the song. So it's possible that she spontaneously said all of this, but it seems like most commentaries don't agree with that. Now, of course, we could go with the critical view, which is that it was all written later after the fact and put into the book by some editor or whatever. I don't think we're going to be happy with that interpretation. But it seems like what most commentaries go with, even conservative evangelical ones, is that what follows is an actual song, that this is a hymn of victory or a hymn of praise, hymn of thanksgiving that was already in the culture. And she is now just citing it here. Perhaps she has tweaked it a little bit to make it a little more relevant for her situation, but as we go through it, we'll see that it's not explicitly about her necessarily. It's just kind of more of a general song of thanks and victory. This, of course, I think raises some interesting question about Mary's song. You have, of course, the interpretation that Mary just says her song spontaneously. You have the view that she wrote it later after the fact, and Luke just included it in his gospel while he was writing it. You have the view, of course, that it was written much, much later, and it was inserted at some point, which most commentators I don't think go with. A view that you don't see, at least I haven't found commentaries go along with it, is the view that perhaps Mary's song was also kind of a song that was already in the culture that she just sort of appropriates and applies to her situation. I mean, it seems like if that's the case with Hannah, why couldn't it be with Mary? But commentaries just don't really go with it. But anyway, as we'll go through, we'll talk about Hannah's song and the meaning of it, the poetry, the significance, and all that good stuff. So the song begins simply enough. My heart rejoices in the Lord, my horn is lifted up. So the hallmark of Hebrew poetry, I've already taken you through a few psalms, but it doesn't hurt to go over it. The different cultures have different ways of writing poetry. These can be, there are all kinds of conventions. So it can be meter, the flow of the words. It can be the imagery associated with it. One of the most common features that we see in English poetry, of course, is the rhyme. Roses are red, violets are blue, sugar is sweet, and so are you, right? So blue and you rhyme. But that's not the only convention. You do have, of course, you have all kinds of patterns. You have an AA pattern, an AABB pattern, an ABAB pattern, all kinds of patterns you could do, playing with the idea of rhyme. And of course, you have free-form poetry, like Walt Whitman, which I don't think is actually poetry. I don't like Walt Whitman. And just all kinds, and there's all kinds of plays you can do with meter and tone and so forth. But with Hebrew poetry, the The core of the poetry is on parallelism. So you'll say a line, and then you'll say a second line that somehow informs the first line. So the question is, how are the two lines working together? Some are fairly straightforward, call them maybe synonymous parallels. Some can be antithetical, some can be progressive, and so on and so forth. All kinds of different ways of, and this is the foundation of Hebrew poetry. It's just going through and understanding how the couplets work together. So here we have, of course, a very obvious parallel. So my heart rejoices in the Lord, my horn is lifted up by the Lord. So you can see you have heart and horn that are being paralleled, and then the end of the line both refers to Yahweh. So the first line, my heart rejoices in the Lord. The question becomes, of course, what does she mean by heart? What is she thinking of conceptually? So this involves an anatomy lesson. I'm sure that's just exactly what you wanted to hear. So, when it comes to conception and imagery, very disturbed. When it comes to conception, we have the brain and we have the heart. And we tend to associate the brain as the center of rational thought. And we tend to associate the heart as the center of emotions. I feel with my heart, I think with my brain. That is not at all how people in the ancient world thought. That's not the conventions they used. That's not the language that they're using. So in the ancient world, and this is pretty much universal across most of the cultures, the heart is the center of rational thought. This is where you think. This is where you plot and scheme and all that good stuff. The center of irrational thought, not necessarily emotions, but irrational thought is your kidneys. You love with your kidneys. If you've ever been confused by Song of Songs or some of the love poetry, love is always associated with the kidneys. It actually makes a lot of sense, right? All rational thought comes from above your waist, and all irrational thought comes from below your waist. That's how they're thinking about it. It actually makes sense. Now, you may be thinking, okay, but what does this do? This does nothing. This is not an organ in their minds. This produces snot, according to the Egyptian anatomy texts. This is useless. You don't need this. You need the heart, you need your kidneys. Those are like the two most important organs. Everything else is just kind of extra, I guess. So this has a lot of weird implications when we think about certain passages where the heart is mentioned, if the heart is the center of rational thought. For example, oh boy, a verse that everybody loves. Everybody loves. 1 Samuel 13. But now your kingdom shall not continue. The Lord has sought out a man after his own heart, and the Lord has commanded him to be prince over his people because you have not kept what the Lord commanded you. Oh boy, David, a man after God's own heart. What on earth does that mean? And how it tends to, I hear this cited so often. He's a man after God's own heart. But what does that mean exactly, to be a man after God's own heart? I'm not sure that most people I hear cite it know what it means or have thought through what it actually means. So I think on surface, how we would immediately, kind of the initial connection would be that David is somehow in tune with God's desires, that he, in some sense, feels what God feels, or I don't know how to say it. He feels what God feels. But if that's what it is, I'm not sure that that really applies to David. I get it, but David, he's a soft soul. He plays the harp and all that good stuff. No, he's a warmongering man whore. He murders and has affairs and all that good stuff. I don't think that he has an emotional connection to Yahweh, at least not the way we see others, such as Jeremiah, maybe Ezekiel, Hosea. I think there are other contenders for that role. So what does this mean? Well, because we go back to the idea that the heart is the center of rational thought. If there's something unique about Yahweh and David's relationship, it has to be something about rationality. That David in some way is in tune with the way Yahweh thinks. He thinks like Yahweh thinks. He knows what Yahweh's plans are and is willing to bring those to fruition. They're on the same wavelength mentally, essentially. I think that's what is really going after. The To this point, the Holman doesn't even have the word heart in it, which is rather interesting. So by now your reign will not endure. The Lord has found a man loyal to him, and the Lord has appointed him as a ruler over his people. So they've just removed the word heart and substituted it with the word loyal, which is interesting. So they're taking it very non-literally. But then the next line, of course, is, my horn is lifted up by the Lord. So then what does horn mean? And why use it in this context? Well, we see horn used a lot in poetry. And it can mean different things. So it can be a symbol of physical strength, like the horn of an animal, whether we're talking about a cow or some sort of goat or whatever. It can be a depiction of divinity. We see this with ancient gods and idols and that sort of thing. This is a famous stela of Naram Sin, the grandson of Sargon the Great. And in it, he's standing over bodies of men, and on his head are 2 horns, because he is proclaiming himself to be deity. We know that to be true. Like he's the first one to say, I am God of the world. That's one of his famous epithets. It can also be some sort of symbol of sexual prowess, which is probably not what she means here. So she's probably talking about physical strength. So when she says, my heart rejoices, and then my horn is lifted up, we have there's a parallel going on. But the question is, what is the parallel? Well, if heart is something internal, something rational, and a horn is a metaphor for physical strength, such as an animal, then she's saying that my interior is rejoicing in God, but my external, right, the strength, my abilities, and all of that is being lifted up by him. So she's connecting what is internal with what is external. We'd call this a merism. So there's actually a word for this, a word for everything. So the idea of taking opposites, in this sense, the internal with the external, as a way of saying everything, right? From the inside to the outside. All of it is celebrating Yahweh. My mouth boasts over my enemies because I rejoice in your salvation. This is sort of maybe a cause and effect kind of relationship. That she is, I have the ability to boast over, of course, she just gave birth, right? So this is an example why this might be more of a song of victory that she's now applying to herself. She hasn't conquered an enemy necessarily, but she has given birth. She has overcome this trial in her life. And because she has overcome this, right, because she has defeated her enemy, defeated the adversary metaphorically, she can now rejoice in Yahweh's salvation. So there's a relationship between the 2 lines. And then she goes, there is no one holy like the Lord, there is no one beside you. So this is probably more of a synonymous parallel, that it's a restatement of the same thing, that Yahweh is holy, and we can ask what that means. It's something that is set apart, but more than that, right? He is the uniquely other. He is something different than everything else. And there is no one beside you. So not only is he different, he is also unique, right? So it's a way of saying the same thing. Then we get a third line, and this is odd. This should be strange, because Hebrew poetry is based on couplets, 2 lines. And yet here we're going to get a third line that seems to be commentating on the first 2. He's holy, he is unique, and there is no one like him. So some sort of reflection on the first 2 lines. Now, when we say he's a rock, right? The Lord liveth, and blessed be the rock. So this is a very famous metaphor. We see this fairly consistently in Hebrew poetry. We probably don't mean rock as a little, like this. We mean some sort of a foundation that you can stand on and be safe, be secure. You can be built on. He's not a little stone. He is something large. He is like a mountain that you can have security on. You can be safe on. You can be protected by the adversaries, the enemies. Then it goes on in verse 3. Do not boast so proudly or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him. So we have two lines, and two lines are usually broken into couplets themselves. So do not boast so proudly or let arrogant words come out of your mouth. That's should be fairly straightforward. And then there's a causal relationship. You can't boast, you can't be arrogant, and so forth, because Yahweh is a God of knowledge. He knows things. He knows that which is hidden. He knows the mysterious. And actions are weighed by him, that he acts on that knowledge. So there's a very famous saying, God laughs when you make plans. There's the old Asian proverb, demons laugh when you talk about the future. Even James, in James 4, says, come now, you who say today or tomorrow we will travel to such and such a city and spend a year there and do business and make a profit. You don't even know what tomorrow will bring, what your life will be, for you are like smoke that appears for a little while, then vanishes. Instead you should say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. So the point seems to be that you can't boast, you can't be proud, you can't be arrogant because you don't know what the future's going to hold. But Yahweh does. So even though, because poetry, part of the beauty of poetry is saying a lot with very few words and using the flow of the imagery to kind of build a message. So by saying you can't boast, you can't be proud, you can't be arrogant, and then say, but God knows things, right? And not only does he know things, he acts on it. So you can't boast because you don't know what's going to happen, but God does. And he knows, and he's going to do things based on that knowledge. So then we get, the bows of the warriors are broken, but the feeble are clothed with strength. So we're going to get a series of parallels that are almost absurd. Right? The bows of the warriors are broken. So those who are strong, those who have weapons, they are going to be rendered useless. Right? Because that's not the way things are supposed to be. Warriors aren't supposed to have their bows broken, right? They need their bows. They're going to fight with their bows. And the feeble, right, are lifted up. So this is a fairly consistent and very well-known imagery we see all through the Old Testament, well into the New Testament, the idea of reversal. The strong are made weak. The poor are made rich. The weak are made strong. The proud are made humble. So the reversal of roles. So the warrior has their bow broken. They're no longer a warrior, right? They can't fight anymore because their weapon's gone. And the feeble, those who are humble, those who are, of no worth, are lifted up. Those who are full hire themselves out for food, but those who are starving hunger no more. So those who have food, those who have stored up food, those who are content in what they have are going to need more. Right? So those who have plenty are not going to have plenty anymore. But those who are starving are going to be full. Again, this is all just part of the reversal of roles. The woman who is childless gives birth to 7, but the woman with many sons pines away. So the woman who has no children, like Hannah, is going to have children because this is what God does, right? He gives children to the childless. And the one who has a lot of kids, something's going to happen to them. She's going to be mourning or going to be not happy, presumably because something happens to her kids. For the Lord is a God of knowledge, and actions are weighed by him. Again, I've reinserted this as just to make the point of this line, that you don't know what's going to happen. But God does, right? He's already planned the future. He's already made plans according to that. The idea that, okay, I see. Okay, I see. So then we get verse 6. The Lord brings death and gives life. He sends some to Sheol and raises others up. This is a really interesting verse, especially if we take this as an early psalm, which most commentaries want to do. They say that this is early. This, again, might be a hymn of victory written before Hannah, that she's just singing here and is recorded. So the Lord brings death and gives life. This is, yes, he is a God of life and death. When throughout the ancient world, it's fairly consistent and fairly simple to just say you have gods of life and you have gods of death, right? You have good gods and you have bad gods. And you want to align yourself with the good gods because they'll give you life, they'll give you fertility, they'll give you all the blessings, and you want to distance yourself from the bad gods, like Hades, right? Hades is a god of death. You don't like Hades. Don't align yourself with Hades. However, if you are monotheistic and only believe in one God, then that means one God is ultimately over life and death, right? He brings both. That, if that makes you uncomfortable, Isaiah says this as much. He says, I form light and create darkness. This is the Holman. It says, I make success and create disaster. That is not what the Hebrew says. I would tell you what it says, but that would probably make you uncomfortable. In the Hebrew, it says, I give good and bad. Or more literally, it says, I give good and evil, which I know makes people really uncomfortable to think about. I, Yahweh, do all these things. So the idea that Yahweh, as the one God, as the only God, he is responsible for everything, which, if he is all-powerful, if he is the only God, that is true. Ultimately, he is responsible for everything. So here we get, he is the one who brings death, okay, and he's also the one who gives life. But then we also get, he's the one who sends some to Sheol. Now, I get in trouble because I'm comfortable associating Sheol with hell. I even did this in one of my classes under Dr. Chisholm, and he kind of yelled at me, like, you can't do that, because Sheol and hell aren't the same thing. So Sheol is a place down deep under the earth. It is a dark place of suffering where you're away from God, and there's wailing and gnashing of teeth, and it's miserable, and you never get out of there. But it's not hell. Because they didn't understand what hell was back then. I don't know. I'm not convinced with that argument. But we then get, so he sends some to Sheol, which is the afterlife, right? And then others get raised up. So some go down to the afterlife and some don't. I was going through some commentaries and I couldn't find a clear interpretation of what this means. I would assume that, because, so, where modern scholarship is they have accepted the premise, so now we're just going to go, this is just fun. So, modern scholarship has accepted the premise that Jews prior to the exile did not believe in an afterlife. They adhered to annihilationism. You get this life, you die, and that's it. You just cease to exist. I do not adhere to this. I think it's cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. I think it's a really stupid idea. But there are plenty evangelicals, plenty of conservatives, plenty of traditionally minded scholars who have just completely bought into this. And the idea of an afterlife is a later development. If that were true, then Israel would be completely unique in the ancient world. They would be the only people on earth that did not have a conception of the afterlife. And then you have to answer why. Why would they reject an afterlife? Especially if they came out of Egypt, which has a very elaborate understanding of the afterlife. I mean, incredibly elaborate. One of the most elaborate of all the ancient mythologies. The Canaanites believed in an afterlife. The Moabites believed in an afterlife. The Ugaritic believed in an afterlife. The Hittites believed in an afterlife. Why would Israel reject the idea of an afterlife? There's no answer for this. There is no answer. Well, they just didn't. That's not an argument. The argument for why they don't is because if they did believe in an afterlife, we would get more explicit instructions about what that looks like. Because we get these vague references to Sheol, we get these vague references to you die and you go to your fathers, but we don't get any clear depictions about what that is. Now, when you get to the New Testament, Jesus gives us a lot of very vivid descriptions, but that's New Testament. You get some language in the Psalms, but those are the Psalms. That's just colorful exaggerations. We can't really rely on that. So, yeah, so they just don't believe in an afterlife. Okay, there's no afterlife. Then there's the issue of, well, what about the resurrection? Well, that was just kind of made up in the intertestamental period. This is a very standard view among even evangelical scholars. So here we get, he sends some to Sheol, which even if we take that as just death, he just sends some to die, to the afterlife, whatever that is. Some don't go to the afterlife, which raises the question, well then, where are they going, right? If it's not down, then, and it says he raises them up, so what does that mean, raising them up? I assume what most interpreters would say to this is, well, some die and some don't. Like he lets some, you have a sick person, right? You have two sick people. And sometimes he lets a person die, and sometimes he lets a person live. But we already have that in the first line. Like, so what's new in the second one? I'm comfortable, although I know that some of my teachers would not be happy with me saying this, I'm comfortable saying some basically go to hell, if we can take Sheol as something comparable to our idea of hell, that there's an afterlife that's dark and miserable and you don't want to go there, and some people get raised up, which to me is mildly referential to maybe the resurrection. Some people don't stay dead. But again, that's going to be making some people angry with me. So then we get verse 7. The Lord brings poverty and gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. So, so this is again just a couplet with the reversal of roles. So he gives poverty and he gives wealth. He humbles and he exalts. That's just like, he brings the good and he brings the bad. That's just another way of saying it, right? He brings poverty, he brings wealth, and so on. Then we get, in verse 8, I think, a rather interesting construction. And this is an example of how constructions can get rather elaborate. So in the first pair, we have, he raises the poor from the dust and lifts the needy from the garbage pile. That seems to be rather synonymous. That's just kind of a restatement of the same thing. There's the poor that are in a bad situation, and it's just being stated twice. And then in the second one, he says, or she says, he seats them with noblemen and gives them a throne of honor, which again seems to be a restatement of the same thing. And yet, taking the two as separate parallels, they are contrasting each other, right? In the one case, you have, he raises the poor from the bad situation, and then you have in the second one, an elaboration of where that means. So, right, he seats them with honor and he gives them a throne of honor. So he takes the poor, raises them up, and then he applies them to these situations of nobility and honor. This is one of the more explicit parallels we see with Mary's song. So there have been a number of studies trying to compare Mary's song to Hannah's song. This is one of the better parallels. So in verses 52 to 53, Mary says, he has toppled the mighty from their thrones and exalted the lowly. There's that reverse of situations. He has satisfied the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. So this is very reminiscent, right? Raising up the poor and taking the hungry and giving them food, sending the rich, making them poor. Very similar imagery. Then in verse 8, for the foundations of the earth are the Lord's, he has set the world on them. So we've moved away from the language of the parallels and the poor, the rich, poverty, wealth, and so on. And now we're just making sort of broad declaration. He has taken the foundations of the earth. He has set the world on them. This is more of a declaration of his power, what he has done, expanding out, big picture kind of idea. Because he guards the steps of his faithful ones, but the wicked perish in darkness, for a man does not prevail by his own strength. Here we get the parallel, right? The first two lines. He guards the step of the faithful ones. So it's a parallel, but they're contrasting, obviously. The first line is talking about the faithful. Second line is talking about the wicked. We see this all the time in the Psalms, Psalm 1, and many, many others. And So we have a contrasting parallel, one talking about the faithful, one talking about the wicked, and then a third line, again, not fairly common, but occasionally we get a third line that seems to be commenting on the parallel. So we see how that works, right? Two lines paralleling each other in a contrasting way, the faithful versus the wicked, and then a third line sort of commenting on the parallel itself. Man does not prevail, and that seems to apply to both of them, right? Whether we're talking about the faithful or the wicked, neither prevail unless God allows it to happen. So that's how that tends to work. Verse 10, those who oppose the Lord will be shattered. He will thunder in the heavens against them. This is probably an example of maybe progressive parallelism. So here we have a broad statement about those who oppose the Lord. They're going to be defeated. They're going to lose. And then we get an elaboration of what that looks like. So the heavens themselves rage against them, right? The heavens being the domain of God, whether we're thinking about that in terms of the armies or the power of God or the natural elements or whatever, they are turned against them because they're rebelling against God. Then we get the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He will give power to his king. And here again, we got another parallel. The Lord judges, but the relationship goes from, this is interesting, right? The relationship goes from God who rules. God rules all of creation. But then it goes to king, which there shouldn't be one in Israel yet, right? Because this is Hannah praying. So we'll say the one who rules on behalf of Yahweh. But the parallel, right? We go from Yahweh himself who rules to the one who rules on behalf of Yahweh. So Yahweh rules, and he empowers the one that he puts in a position of authority. And there's a third line to verse 10. He will lift up the horn of his anointed. So this is interesting, right? Because again, we have the parallel with a third line. So the Lord will judge the ends of the earth. He gives power to the king. And then we have another reference to the horn of the anointed being the one chosen by God, whether it's a king, a prophet, priest, whoever. But what I wanted to point out is this is rather interesting because the last line of verse 10 parallels the last line of verse 1 because they both have the word horn in it. This is another thing you can do in Hebrew poetry. The parallels don't have to be next to each other. They can be on other ends of the psalm. And the technical word is inclusio, where you begin a psalm with a line and you end the psalm with a line. We also, less technically, can call them bookends. That way you have a way of beginning the psalm and a way of ending the psalm. And the basic meaning is the same, right? That the power, right, is given by Yahweh and it's being lifted up by Yahweh. So, verse 11, Elkanah went home to Ramah, but the boy served the Lord in the presence of Eli the priest. And so we're going to, moving forward, right, we get this story, or we get a bit of a reflection on Eli and his family situation. The contrast seems to be rather overt. So Hannah is being faithful, right? She has prayed, she's gotten a kid, she has dedicated her child to the Lord, and she has given him over to the temple, right, to serve in the temple. She is the faithful mother. Eli, on the other hand, as we're going to find out, has a bad family life. His kids are not good. So Hannah being the faithful mother is now going to be contrasted with Eli being the unfaithful father. And it begins with verses 12 to 14. Eli's sons were wicked men. They had no regard for the Lord or for the priest's share of the sacrifices from the people. When any man offered a sacrifice, the priest's servant would come with a 3-pronged meat fork while the meat was boiling and plunge it into the container or kettle or cauldron or cooking pot. So here we get a rather famous reference to the 3-pronged fork. Now, in our cultural representations of the devil, there are various features that tend to get used over and over again. So there's horns, which are probably a reference to pagan deities. We see this language all through the Old Testament, the horns of the dragon and so forth. He has a goatee often in a lot of portraits. I am convinced, I had a professor show me this once, and I am absolutely convinced that it is because of Attila the Hun. This is a famous Roman coin with his face. You can see he's got what looks to be slight horns on the top of his head because he's demonic. He has very elongated features, and he has what looks like a goatee. Looks kind of like how some depictions of Satan are. Attila the Hun was a scourge on Rome, and it makes sense, I guess, that they would demonize him, and that later painters would use his likeness in their depictions of the devil. So you got the goatee. You have that he's often associated with red. Some theories say this because of blood. Some say this because of the red dragon in Revelation. He often has wings. Sometimes they're angelic wings. Sometimes they're like bats, but that's because he's a fallen angel, of course. Sometimes he has goat legs, which is always fun. He's often portrayed playing the fiddle. This is probably a reference to Nero, who played the fiddle while Rome burned. And he often is portrayed with a three-pronged pitchfork, which is the only explanation I've ever heard is that this is a reference to Hophni and Phineas, using their three-pronged fork to get the food out. Now, interestingly enough, Hades also uses a pitchfork, which you may not have known. And you may think, well, maybe they're associating Satan with Hades, which would make sense. However, does anybody know what the problem with that is? So I'm going to show you a picture of the Banquet of the Gods by Raphael. We're going to zoom in on Zeus, Poseidon, and Hades. Poseidon famously has the trident, right? Hades has the bivdent. Hades' pitchfork has two prongs, which is interesting because I've never seen a depiction of Satan with a two-pronged pitchfork. It's always three. Because if they were going with the Greco-Roman imagery and they wanted to associate Satan with Hades, which would make sense, right? You would do the two-pronged pitchfork. It's always three. So the only interpretation I've ever heard is that, because this is the only time, as far as I'm aware, that the three-pronged fork is ever mentioned in the Bible, and it's obviously used in the desecration of sacrifices. So Satan, in a lot of pop culture references, is carrying a three-pronged pitchfork because of it. So in verses 14 to 15, the priest would claim for himself whatever the meat fork brought up. This is the way they treated all the Israelites who came there to Shiloh, even before the fat was burned. The priest's servants would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, "Give the priest some meat to roast, because he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw." So there's a lot wrong with this. A lot wrong. There are all kinds of laws in Leviticus about how you accept sacrifices and what you can do with them, what you can't do with them, what you're allowed to accept as a priest, what you can't accept. And this is just one example from Leviticus 3. He will present part of the fellowship sacrifice as a fire offering to the Lord. This is the priest. The fat surrounding the entrails, all the fat that is on the entrails and the two kidneys, with the fat on them at the loins. He will also remove the fatty lobe of the liver with the kidneys. Aaron's sons will burn it on the altar along with the burnt offering that is on the burning wood, a fire offering or a pleasant aroma to the Lord. You don't get to keep the fat. You don't get to eat the fat. You don't get to keep the choice parts. This is fairly consistent across a lot of the ancient cultures. The best parts go to the deity. The fat goes to the deity. Verses 16, if that man said to him, "The fat must be burned first, then you can take whatever you want for yourself," the servant would reply, "No, I insist that you hand it over right now. If you don't, I'll take it by force." So the servant's sin was very severe in the presence of the Lord, because they treated the Lord's offering with contempt. So they're trying to take the best parts of the sacrifice, and they're trying to take the fat, both of which you're not allowed to do. In Leviticus 7, you have the Lord spoke to Moses, "Tell the Israelites, you are not to eat any fat of any ox, a sheep, or a goat, the fat of an animal that dies naturally or is mauled by wild beasts, may be used for any purpose, but you must not eat of it. If anyone eats animal fat from a fire offering presented to the Lord, the person who eats it must be cut off from his people. Wherever you live, you must not eat the blood of any bird or animal. Whoever eats any blood, that person must be cut off from his people. This goes back to the Noahic offerings. You're not allowed to eat blood. But here, again, there are strict stipulations for what you can accept as priest. No blood, no fat. And the choice parts always go to the Lord. And obviously, they're not abiding by that. And Yahweh is not very happy with them. Now, this isn't the only thing that they're doing. They're doing other stuff too, which we'll find out about later. But at least initially, this is what our attention is drawn to. And so we get the little the sort of the snapshot of what Eli's sons are like, and this is who Samuel's been entrusted to. I mean, my first thought is this is not a good start, right? That Eli has not proven himself very capable with kids. He's kind of maybe a bad influence or just too permissive or whatever, and yet he presumably is the one who's going to be raising Samuel. So in verse 18, the boy served Samuel in the Lord's presence and wore a linen ephod. Now, this verse is really interesting. Can anyone guess why this verse is interesting? You guys are no fun. Not just any priest. High priest wears the ephod. So the high priest, when I didn't put all the other pictures I could have, but the high priest is dressed to the nines, right? So the high priest wears a linen sort of an undergown, and it's the white thing at the bottom. You can see it popping out. It's linen, it's white, it's kind of light. It's probably cooler, probably more comfortable to wear. It also, I believe, is primarily for hygiene. It's probably easier to clean. On top of that, he wears a blue robe, a thicker, heavier robe. And then on top of that, I haven't been able to find a good picture that I'm satisfied with, so just go with me. So he wears the linen white undergown, he wears the blue robe on top, and then he wears the multicolored vest, which is the ephod. It's like a sweater vest. It's one piece of cloth, but it covers the chest to the belt, to the waist. I'm not happy with either of these pictures, but I just need something as a visual representation that you can just kind of follow with me with. So he wears the linen undergarment, the robe, and then the multicolored vest strewn with, the red cloth, the purple cloth, the blue cloth, all that stuff. This multicolored, beautiful vest, ephod, it's a sweater vest. And then on the sweater vest, right, on the shoulders, he has the plates that are sewn into it. Well, there are like metal ringlets sewn into the ephod, the sweater vest. And then the plates, which has Israel's names engraved on them, are then latched onto the rings. And then, because you have the shoulder plates, right, then you have chains coming down from the shoulder plates, and on the chains hangs the breastplate. And on the breastplate are the names of the 12 tribes with the stones. They're not terrible pictures, but they're not exactly accurate. I don't know what the sashes are supposed to be. I guess it's supposed to be the ephod, but it's not great. Also, the high priest wears a turban, and the turban is white, so it's made of the same cloth as the undergarment. But the turban of the high priest also has a gold band around the turban that has the name of Yahweh on it, because he bears the name of Yahweh. So he has literally the names of Israel on his shoulder, because he bears Israel on his shoulders, and he has the name of Yahweh on his forehead. So this is the high priest, right? Now, so you got the high priest, and then you have all the other priests. But the other priests, they wear, and this picture I think is decent, at least for what the priests normally wear. The high priests aren't right. I can't find a good picture of a high priest. But the regular priests, because they're the ones out doing all the manual labor, they're the ones out taking the sacrifices, they're the ones working with the animals, they're the ones killing and slaughtering and doing all the fun stuff. They wear white robes. And it's probably a combination of white for purity, white for righteousness, all that stuff, but also I would imagine because it's just cooler. Because you don't want to wear a thick, heavy, blue robe or whatever, a darker color, when you're out working with the animals all day. You want something light, something comfortable. So they get to wear these nice, soft, clean linen robes, and they wear these kind of smaller white turbans. They're not as ornate. They don't have the plate on their heads like the high priest does. But they do get a really fancy sash, a belt. That's made of the same material and same pattern as the priest's ephod. Because they're in uniform. What? Okay. There's a picture in there? Oh. But the regular priests, they do get the sash that's supposed to match the high priest's ephod. So again, they're all in uniform, right? But the regular priests, the ones doing all the day labor, they don't wear an ephod. But Samuel gets an ephod, which is interesting, right? Because that's normally something only the high priest would get to wear. So is that foreshadowing? Because Samuel doesn't officially take over as high priest, but it is interesting that he gets a garment that normally you would only associate with the high priest. He is going to take over as judge. He's going to take over and kind of be the next leader of Israel. So maybe this is sort of foreshadowing his service as one of the anointed, right? But it is curious that it actually calls out and tells us that he gets this little ephod to wear. And just kind of picturing little Samuel, however old he is, 5, 6 years old, running around the temple wearing this ephod. So in verses 18, each year his mother made him a little robe and took it to him when she went with her husband to offer the annual sacrifice. Eli would bless Elkanah and his wife. May the Lord give you children by this woman in place of the one she has given to the Lord. Then they would go home. So Samuel, right, so she gets to see him, right, at least once a year when they go and offer the sacrifices. And every year she gets to make him new priest garments, essentially. I would imagine that he gets his own little robe, kind of like what the regular priest would wear, so probably something kind of like this, just a linen robe that he would wear. Maybe he gets a turban, I don't know. But again, as we're told, he has his own little ephod, which is rather curious. Like, what does that symbolize? I don't know. But it is interesting. So he gets his own little linen robe, and he gets his own little vest that he gets to wear. I haven't found a good picture of that, but you should be able to visualize it yourself, right? He's wearing the robe, he's wearing his little vest, and he's like, 6, 7, 8 years old, however old he's at the time. And the Lord paid attention to Hannah's need, and she conceived and gave birth to 3 sons and 2 daughters. Meanwhile, the boy Samuel grew up in the presence of the Lord. So here we get a nice little end to the story, right? Hannah, who has been faithful, she's donated her son to the Lord. She hasn't completely cut off ties. It's not like she ever gets to see him again, but he is growing. He's dedicated to the temple. He's stuck at the temple. But God has not forgotten her. She has more kids. And she's been blessed. And we get then this final line that, because if there was any concern or doubt of what might happen to Samuel, right? Because it doesn't say that he grew up in the presence of Eli. That might be ominous, right? It says he grew up in the presence of the Lord, as if Yahweh himself is the one looking after Samuel and ensuring that he's turning out okay, right? Because he's going to be the one to take over and to lead Israel. So I think we're going to stop there for tonight, if we're okay ending a little early. If you want to come up here and close.
It's kind of like ending a sermon early, having a shorter sermon. A deacon told me one time, not one church as I pastor, he said there's never a bad short sermon. So there's never a bad short Bible study. Everybody likes to get out early. All right, well, let's pray together, and then we'll be dismissed. Father, we thank you for today. We thank you for your blessings, Lord, and we pray that you would take this word, Lord. It's been talk to us and strengthen us, Lord, and help us as we continue to mull it over and feed on it and meditate upon it. And just thank you for each one that was here tonight. Be with those who are in physical and material need tonight, Lord, and give them comfort. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen.